Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm never sure this time of year whether it's afternoon or evening right now. And thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a lecture by Professor Deepak Sarma, who is a longtime member of our religious studies faculty and a distinguished scholar in public humanities at Case Western Reserve University. Looking out at the audience, I'm also prompted to say welcome back because I know I've seen many of you at Dr. Aaron Benet's previous lecture. So Aaron, like Deepak, was named a distinguished scholar in the public humanities earlier this year, and this is the inaugural awarding of this recognition. And we're very proud that two of our faculty colleagues have received this unprecedented recognition and excited about the contributions that they will continue to make. As I pointed out last month at Professor Benet's lecture, the College of Arts and Sciences has a rich tradition of engaging with the larger community to share the fruits of humanities scholarship and apply insights from the humanities to issues of public concern. Deepak's work fits into but also extends this tradition. A member of the Case Western Reserve faculty since 2004, Deepak was named a full professor in the Department of Religious Studies in 2012. The same year, he received a secondary appointment in the Department of Bioethics in the School of Medicine. Deepak's research interests include classical Indian philosophy and Hinduism, subjects they have explored as the author of 2 monographs and the editor of 2 anthologies. They also participate in the fields of cultural theory, post-colonial studies, museum studies, and the application of Hindu, religious, and philosophical ideas to problems in bioethics. There are many facets to Deepak's contributions in the public humanities. They serve as a cultural consultant to American Greetings, Netflix, and Moonbug Entertainment, a global company that produces programming for children. And I really had the pleasure of watching one of those videos recently, and I was just enthralled and knew that my grandchildren would really enjoy it as well. Deepak helps these corporations avoid perpetuating religious, colonial, and gender stereotypes. Deepak is a curatorial consultant for the Department of Asian Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where they curated an exhibition of Indian paintings in 2011. In addition, Deepak is regularly quoted by the media, including the Associated Press and the U.S. News and World Report, on topics ranging from the inauguration of Kamala Harris to the selection of new Jeopardy's host. Recently, Deepak has explored ethical and philosophical questions surrounding the use of psychedelic drugs. This research has led him to the topic of today's lecture: is there an ordinary state of consciousness? Please join me in welcoming Deepak Sarma to the podium.
Namaste and greetings. It is a delight to be here and to have been invited to speak as the inaugural Distinguished Scholar in the Public Humanities. I am especially grateful to Ben Vinson, who some of you know was the provost of CWRU before leaving to become president of Howard University. It is thanks to his vision and his recognition for the work that I've done, am doing, and for his anticipation for the work that I'm going to do, that I believe that I've been given this voice. I'm so grateful to him. Before leaving, Ben encouraged me to continue to challenge and to provoke and to incite others to do the same. And it is in this spirit that I speak with you today. And I think I see a few people who are in my classes here and have taken classes with me in the past. And let me just say, before I begin, is that what I do here at Case is what all I want to do here at Case is get people to think about and reflect on their presuppositions. And if I have done that in any class I do, in any seminar I do, or in this talk, then I have done exactly what I want to do. Okay? That doesn't mean I'm going to change your mind. It doesn't mean I'm going to convince you of my position. But if I can get you to recognize what your basic presupposition is, then I will have done my work. And it's in that spirit that not only am I a professor at Case, but that I'm giving this talk with you today, or giving this talk today. So first, what are the public humanities? In this connection, there's much debate and dialogue about what it means to be a scholar in the public humanities. Defining the public humanities is a bit like defining pornography. People know what it is when they see it, but when asked to define it, they might offer so many different and varied definitions that the definitions themselves seem too broad or too narrow. From my perspective, the public humanities entails being a public intellectual. Claiming to be one, or desiring to be one, sounds awfully presumptuous and pompous, I know, and can be dangerous. And many academics shy away from or even deride public scholarship of this sort. I felt this sort of derision right here at CWRU, alas, when I was invited to guest curate at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which culminated with the Colligot painting exhibits in summer 2011. It is indeed ironic that aspirational institutions like Harvard and Yale celebrate, endorse, and promote their public intellectuals, while the humanities and social science faculty at Case Western University almost seem to do the opposite. Alas, I am grateful that the administrators here and conversations that I had with Lee certainly were encouraging in this connection. Thanks to the staff at the CMA, I learned very quickly that to curate meant to steward their amazing objects and artifacts, and to make them understandable, meaningful, and provocative, and to channel their magic to CMA patrons. I remember being quite surprised to learn that when writing the labels for the Colligot paintings, that my target audience was not PhD students or postdocs. Rather, I should aim to write to those with high school literacy, they kept saying, high school literacy. I needed to present ideas and histories that was comprehensible to a much larger group of people than to which I was accustomed. Needless to say, I had to leave the splendid isolation of the heights of the ivory tower for something very different. Being a curator, guest or otherwise, meant, of course, being a public intellectual. But I was encouraged to abandon the dizzying heights of the ivory tower long before by Professor Paul Griffiths, my PhD advisor at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. He stipulated that academic writing ought to be comprehensible by anyone who was interested, no matter their educational backgrounds. So I continued to write, and I hope to speak in such a way that complicated ideas and issues are intelligible to anyone who is curious. Are people curious here a little bit? Good. Hands? Okay, cool. I have passed this sentiment on to my undergraduate students, many of whom are here today. I required them to have all of the papers they write for me, for my classes, proofread by people who are not enrolled in the class, and to include enough introductory materials that the reader can understand the issues that are being raised or addressed. Sometimes I jokingly suggest that they find a random person walking down Euclid Avenue and ask them to proofread their papers. I had one student a few years ago who took me up on that challenge and had a very, very fruitful conversation with a passerby. This student then became an interesting kind of public intellectual. My desire to have an impact outside of the confines of academia has brought my name, as Lee mentioned, to the attention of streaming media companies like Netflix, Amazon, Mattel, Moonbug, and so on, and even American Greetings, that was just mentioned in her very kind introduction. Thank you. I have thus worked with these and other companies as a cultural consultant. Though my expertise focused on avoiding potential cultural pitfalls, much of my work was actually in educating executives and creatives alike. The audiences for these programs are in the hundreds of millions, or in the case of Cocomelon, in the billions. And this harmonizes quite well with my underlying goal to be a public intellectual, even though my work is, so to speak, behind the scenes. So it is in this connection and with this set and setting that I stand before you today. Ordinary state of consciousness. So the title of my talk is questioning this. Is there an ordinary state of consciousness? Is there? I have, for quite some time, at least since elementary school, wondered if there was an ordinary state of consciousness. listening to too much or just enough Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and of course the Grateful Dead, reading Kerouac and Kesey, early experimentation with antihistamines, inhalants, alcohol, cannabis, and eventually psychedelics made this question, shall we say, a very real one. How were these experiences to be understood? How were these experiences that I had to be understood? What were the status of those changes in consciousness? Were they not ordinary? Was there a real behind the real? What was I seeing when I had these experiences? Was I looking at the shadows in the cave rather than having a direct perception of reality? Of course, every good talk should mention Plato. I did it. Such questions and concerns led me to leave an engineering and mathematics program at Cooper Union and NYU, in which I was enrolled in, for, shall we say, the greener pastures of Reed College in Portland, Oregon. There, I not only indulged more heavily in rituals and exercises intended to juxtapose ordinary with non-ordinary states, but I decided to focus my BA thesis on debates among schools of Indian philosophy that ask questions about the nature of reality and consciousness. So I made it a life goal, and here I am giving a talk on it. Lo and behold. The questions were of this sort. Was there a real world independent of the mind, or are all perceptions mind only? Mind created, perhaps. I continued to explore these issues as a graduate student at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, and not surprisingly, wrote my dissertation on the topic. These academic and sometimes recreational investigations were altered profoundly and permanently in 1995. Let me explain. Loss of consciousness. It was April of 1995, and I had just completed and passed my written exams and submitted and had accepted my dissertation proposal. To celebrate this achievement, I traveled to Oregon to officiate a wedding, to go camping, and to do some rock climbing. I stayed at the Outward Bound Camp in Bend, Oregon, one of the best places for outdoor adventures in the United States. I spent my time rafting the Deschutes, exploring the lava tubes, hiking the Three Sisters Wilderness area in the Cascades, and of course, rock climbing at Smith Rock in Bend. Anybody been to Smith Rock in Bend? A couple people? Nobody? You have? Ah. On the morning of 25th May, I went with my girlfriend at the time and 2 Outward Bound guides to climb at Smith. The climbing was phenomenal. I wanted to try some more challenging routes, and by that I meant to lead climb. We hiked down to some formations just below the parking lot, but still about 300 feet above the Crooked River, which wound through the park. I on-sighted a few routes and was ready to try for something harder. On-sighted is when climbers, without any previous advice or info, lead climb to the top of a route on their first attempt. The route was an overhanging crack that I chose that went up about 40 feet, probably about a little bit less than this. It was a bolted route, so I needed only to clip into the protection that had already been placed there. I went up about 20 feet and clipped in twice as the bolts were about 10 feet apart. In my ascent towards the next bolt, I maneuvered to the left of the vertical and ended up 10 feet above and to the left of my previous clip. So if you imagine this corner here, I'm to the left and 10 feet up of my previous clip. I have no memory of what happened after this, but I am told that I either let go, which is possible, or I lost my grip and then I plummeted, unhelmeted. Those days people didn't wear helmets. Unhelmeted into a pendulum-like swing from a high angular displacement, is how physicists explain it. Alas, at the zero position of the pendulum, there was an immovable rock. And the back of my unhelmeted head came into contact with this rock. The rock, not surprisingly, won. Within seconds, I'm told, pink liquid emerged from my ears and my nose, a mixture of blood and cerebrospinal fluid. TBI, traumatic brain injury. There I was, dangling 10 feet above the ground, oblivious to the chaos that followed, the effort to save my life, and unconscious, shall we say, of my lowering to the Crooked River, where there was ample space for the life flight helicopter to land and take me to the hospital in Bend. I was unconscious. I have no memory of what that experience was like, none. Alas, it was not a near-death experience. Anybody here have a near-death experience? A couple people? Where people report traveling to other places, being disassociated from their bodies, seeing a white light, and so on. I didn't have any of that. I am envious of their experience. Alas, alas, I was even denied of that. It was just pure nothing. Who am I? Who am I? Where did I go when I was unconscious? Where did my consciousness go? Is consciousness something that I possess? Like I have a consciousness? Who is this I? This is very strange. Is it different from me? Is my consciousness different from me? Is your consciousness different from you? Where did my awareness go? Where was I when I was not? Is it I think, therefore I am, and therefore I am not? Was I no more? Or is there more than meets the eye? It's when we emerge from such states of nothing, that we become self-aware. But when I emerged, it was very different. Everything was different. Everything, consciousness as well, was not ordinary. Everything was extraordinary. Or was I like the person in that red light TikTok story? Thanks to one of my students for drawing it to my attention. Some of you have heard this story. Am I living now in a parallel universe? Is this a nightmare? Oh, God. To wake up, am I living now in a parallel universe? Am I going to wake up and find myself the eyes of the world? Or am I going to wake up and I'm going to be Deepak in 1995? Like, is it just going to happen? Just like in that TikTok? Where am I? Who am I? When I woke up, why do we use that phrase? Was I asleep? Was I asleep? I was confused. Confused as to who I was, as to why the door to the hotel room was open. I thought I was in a hotel. Confused as to why I was so cold, why I could not see, and I thought maybe I had glasses. Why is everything so blurry? And confused as to the location of a girlfriend, which I thought I might have had. Very confusing. I get out of the bed, strangely shaped with rails. What hotel room has a bed shaped with rails? And I thought that I would look around for an extra blanket. I went out the open door. Why do these hotel rooms have open doors? I thought to myself, looking for this blanket. I had the spins. I could barely stand up. I was looking for this blanket. The hallway was unusually wide, and the floors were surprisingly uncarpeted, industrial, stark, and sanitized. This was not an ordinary hotel room. It was not even extraordinary. And things seemed far from ordinary. In fact, I did not even know what ordinary was or even could be, or if anything would ever again be ordinary. It was a strange and unfamiliar hotel. I don't remember checking in. No, that can't be. I look around. It does look like a hospital. It's just, or is it just a not ordinary hotel? She picks up a clipboard from somewhere, and yes, your name is Deepak Sharma, and you had a rock climbing accident at Smith Rock. What? That's my name? My head hurts. I feel the bandages on the back of my head. Who am I? Where am I? She takes me by my elbow and walks me back to my room and gives me another blanket. I go to the bathroom and find a pair of glasses, and there's blood on them. Maybe she's telling the truth. Like, what's going on here? Who am I? The doctor will explain more in the morning, she says. I reluctantly, anxiously, and skeptically go back to sleep, ready to wake up from this nightmare, dream, illusion, hallucination. I woke up again and look around. It seemed to be a hospital. A male physician, I shall call him Dr. Huffman, comes in. Hi there, Deepak. Or no, hi there, Deepak. You fell while you were climbing at Smith and had a head injury. You've been in the hospital since blah, 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 blah. I try standing up. My balance is totally off. I can barely walk. My head hurts. I lay back on the bed. My head is pounding now. I can feel the dried blood in my ears. I go back to sleep. Maybe he's right. Maybe there's something wrong. What happened to me? What happened to my consciousness? Who am I? The next few days were confusing, mind-shattering, to say the least. In addition, I had aphasia, which I clearly don't have now, and could not communicate very well at all. I was not sure who I was, but I went along with things. I still do. I went along with, and still go along with, how others identified me. I recall perceiving that my bed was next to a bus. I thought my bed was next to a bus. I remember turning around, and there was a bus behind my bed. Was there a bus behind my head? What kind of extraordinary state of consciousness was I in? Is there an ordinary state of consciousness? The closet to the right of my bed intermittently morphed from a closet to the door of a bus. There is a back door of the bus, and it's on the other side of the bed. There are all sorts of people and other Dr. Seuss-like creatures getting into my closet and getting out on the other side of the bus. It was quite interesting. The flow was very continuous, and I worried about my laptop for some reason, which was in the closet. What if somebody took it? I worried. I asked the nurse. I said, make sure that no one takes my laptop. There are all these people walking around in this bus. Can't she see it? You can't see it? You can't see it? Why is she not concerned? She didn't respond at some point, as you can imagine. I get really sleepy. I try and keep my eyes open so that I can keep an eye on things, so to speak. My head is aching. The weeks and months and years and decades to follow were, are, and continue to be a haze. Ever since then, I have wondered if there was, or if there ever was, an ordinary consciousness. Were my experiences non-ordinary ones? No experience seemed ordinary after my head injury. What is an ordinary state of consciousness? Did the people and creatures I saw really exist? Or were they merely constructions of my mind? Or were all things chitta mantra, mind only, as Vasubandhu, the founder of the Yogacara school of Buddhism, argued in the 3rd century? Was I in a coma? Was I asleep? Was I dead? Am I dead right now? Are you? Or are all of you figments of my imagination? Or nightmare. The category non-ordinary consciousness seems to be an umbrella term that includes the experiences of people with head injuries, epilepsy, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, and most recently, those under the influence of psychedelic drugs. But why posit ordinary consciousness in the first place? Not surprisingly, though the term was used in various ways in the 17th and 18th century, and first by John Locke, and I'll get back to John Locke in a minute, it was reified and defined by psychologists. Alas, like Freud's concepts of the id and ego, which are merely human constructions and models, but have been taken as actually existing, consciousness now is spoken as if it was, rather than it might be. The Charvaka school of Indian philosophy, which posits a kind of material skepticism akin to scientific reductionism, argues that consciousness emerges from a mixture of elements. Like the mixing of specific ingredients produced beer, so the mixing of specific substances produced consciousness. Is this consciousness merely neurochemical activities in the brain? And if so, then are experiences like the one I had after my head injury, and sometimes still have, merely glitches in my brain? Aberrant neurochemical activities? Are they hardware problems, like the ones that we're having here with the sound? If so, then the answer to the question, is there an ordinary state of consciousness, is simple and somewhat uninteresting. STEM researchers can rely on several devices to determine what is normal and normative. They can use EEGs to record electrical activity in the brain. They can use MRIs, which detect changes in blood flow associated with neural activity. They can use an MEG, which gauges magnetic fields generated by neural activity. Thanks to Lee for pointing me in the right direction on this one. They can further conclude that someone is having a non-ordinary state of consciousness when the data from these devices detracts from the data plotted on a bell curve. These, of course, are humanly constructed and established norms. But it's not entirely interesting if we go down this scientific reductionistic pathway. Or is it, as with other schools of Indian philosophy, is it that cognition itself that rather consciousness is merely a component? These eventually are observed in a metaphorical way by the Atman. The Atman metaphorically observes these cognitive components and then makes this huge error metaphorically, thinking that it is identical with these components. So the Atman, which all of you according to these schools have, the Atman finally, or at its core, has no consciousness whatsoever. Consciousness is an attribute to the Atman. And we err when we think that we're identical with the consciousness. So you are all then, according to this school, ultimately consciousless or unconscious. The goal is then for the Atman to use the cognitive components of consciousness to recognize that it is not identical with consciousness. Hopefully some of you are experiencing that right now. And it is believed that once you recognize that you are not identical with consciousness, we are purchasing sensory overload. For Huxley and others, these experiences of having all of your senses and having the valve reduced is made possible through the use of so-called psychedelic drugs. So again, think about all that you are seeing right now, and you're seeing me perhaps. There are people around you. There are people sitting next to you. There are smells. There are probably some sounds, like that hum, which you are ignoring. And you're obviously having all of this sensory input, but you are focusing on just one thing, me speaking, perhaps, or your cell phone. Just me. So you are getting all of this sensory input. And your brain, according to Huxley's model, is a reducing valve, is only allowing some things to be processed. And the use of psychedelic drugs, according to Huxley, and according to others, is the valve is released. And so you have a flood of all of the sensory inputs that you normally are not having. Right? So imagine then if you suddenly weren't able to focus just on my voice, and that instead you are suddenly aware of everything around you and the sounds that you're smelling. I mean, there's little that happens too. The sounds that you're hearing and the smells that you have. This is a position that many scholars have put forth, but psychedelic drugs especially invites the possibility of their truth, shall we say. You should ask yourself then, if you've taken psychedelic drugs, or if you're wondering where is this consciousness that we all have, whether it's something that is independent of you, or it's something that's within your own head, and if you're consuming these kinds of substances, then what is it that you're seeing? Just like when I broke my skull and I started seeing Dr. Seuss creatures behind me, were these creatures actually there? And I'm only seeing them now because I have some change in the valve of my brain? So this question about consciousness necessitates wondering where this consciousness is. Where is this consciousness? Does it channel into us from an external place, as somebody like Huxley wants to suggest? Many rock stars that I've interviewed in other side projects imagine that they're not playing the music at all that they play, that rather they are channeling some kind of music from outside of themselves, and they're merely an instrument, so to speak. They're merely an instrument to allow this music to occur. Right? Bobby Weir of the Grateful Dead thought that the stories were already there independently in the universe someplace, part of a larger consciousness, and that when he sang and he played this music, he was merely channeling it. Right? So if we consider and we think about consciousness in this way, psychedelic drugs changes significantly how we think about the limitations of our valves that we have currently right now, though some of you might be on psychedelics, I'm not sure. Right? Anybody here? No. Right. One second. So in this connection, that the consumption of these drugs and the removal of these valves, then a question you should ask is, does it give you a more direct perception of reality? That we're having indirect experiences of reality now because of these limitations on, or these valves that we're using. Consider a honeybee and what a honeybee can see and what you can't see in comparison to a honeybee. Consider a dog and what a dog can hear and what you can't hear because you can't hear the same frequencies that a dog can hear. So surely there's more out there that's happening that you are unable to experience. Yes? And if so, then this leads to the assumption or the presupposition that there is a larger consciousness that exists independently of your mind, of you, and that you are merely channeling, and you're getting a small portion of it. This would be the mind at large, as Huxley has characterized this. The Nyaya school of Indian philosophy, which is another school of Indian philosophy, believes that you can have a direct perception of reality. And this direct perception, which, not unlike the consumption of psychedelic drugs, is an experience of reality without any conditioning whatsoever. Because when you think about the valves in your brain that are limiting what you're seeing, you are conditioned in such a way such that you are only seeing the things that you are trained to see, right? That you are trained to see or you're conditioned to see. What is it like to see things without any conditioning at all? Not unlike a baby who might see things as they are, without the conditioning of language, without the conditioning of objects, without seeing that if there's something as a bottle. They see things as they are. Buddhists believe that when you achieve nirvana, or you're about to, that you return to being like a baby, where you see things as they are, in a direct perception of reality. This, of course, led people like Timothy Leary and others to embrace Buddhism and to wonder if mystical experiences and drug-induced mystical experiences were the same. In any event, consciousness. Is there an ordinary state of consciousness? So, in my conversation today, I hope that I've had you reflect on whether or not this is just a dream, whether or not this is a nightmare. Some of you, it could be a nightmare. Whether or not you in fact got into that accident and you're just hallucinating in some ICU someplace. Or like that person in that TikTok and suddenly waking up and imagining or having the experience of living 10 years with a family. How many people have heard that TikTok? Right? Having 10 years in a family. How many of you could be possibly experiencing that right now? So, consciousness. Is there an ordinary state of consciousness? Why should there be an ordinary state of consciousness? Last thought. Ordinary states of consciousness. John Locke. I mentioned John Locke, right? So, consider that for John Locke, he wrote a really important treatise on religious freedom and toleration of religion. And what he argued, or what he proposed, is that religions are permissible so long as they do not threaten the stability of the state. Right? So toleration for John Locke and religious toleration is not toleration as we typically understand it. It's toleration in a really negative way. As if I was to say, I tolerate Lee, she would feel really sad. Right? I do more than tolerate you, right? Right? So similarly, John Locke thought that religions were tolerable only insofar as they did not threaten the stability of the state. Now consider ordinary consciousness and the significance of ordinary consciousness in the STEM context. Then consider, and the creation of ordinary consciousness and metrics for ordinary context in the STEM context. Now consider the threat, so to speak, of non-ordinary states of consciousness and how that threat disrupts, disrupts the idealist form of what is an ordinary consciousness. And that ordinary consciousness is really, if we understand it properly, in the STEM context, understood as, let me put it simply, understood as how productive a member you are in a capitalist society. And so a non-ordinary consciousness then threatens the stability of the nation, of the state. So I worry and wonder about ordinary states of consciousness. I haven't had one since 1995, and probably since before then. Right? And, oh, here's a great way to end it. And by having you think about this, and maybe provoking you to wonder about what your basic presuppositions are, I've disrupted things and threatened the stability of the state, and gotten you to question and to wonder about what your basic presuppositions are. So if I have done that, then I have done my job. Thank you.
In Eastern Christianity, there's something called impossibility. In other words, any passion of anybody, like a sexual passion or desire to achieve something, limits your perception and focuses and puts you in a off focus from reality. So impossibility would be a good way to achieve that consciousness without drugs. Ridding yourself of, I don't know, unhealthy appetites or desires.
So surely, I mean, I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but religious communities have, of course, have methods of obtaining these states that are involved fasting or meditation or standing on one foot for a week or something like that, that don't necessarily involve substances. Or like, is that what you're asking?
What's up? Yeah, or just by
Right.
avoiding certain activities which are...
Right, avoiding certain. And if I could just add to this, is that when we think about this question about whether or not you can achieve these states using substances, really the issue is about sudden versus gradual, right? Is that you have kind of institutional religions who say that you can only achieve this gradually under certain kind of guidance with certain kinds of behaviors and practices that are acceptable, and then you take psychedelic drugs and you skip all of those steps. And suddenly it becomes suddenly achievable, whether or not you're bound by that, you're no longer bound by that religious institution. So it becomes a threat to the stability of the religious institution.
I was wondering, is that in relation to something like the placebo effect?
Like the placebo effect, what do you speak of?
So, if it's mind only,
Yeah.
say when you take psychedelic drugs, is there actually an effect? Is it a real effect, or is it something that's imagined?
Right, that's a great question. If things are mind only, according to Vasubandhu, right, that any transition or switch is humanly created, right? So he argues in his Vimcharika Karika that really death is not a big moment, right? It's only kind of you're conditioned to think that it's a switch when it's just a smooth flow, right? So in such a case, if things are mind only and you take psychedelic drugs, then there really is no difference, right? And if you think there's a difference, then you haven't really understood that things are mind only.
Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on medicalization of psychedelics?
So I think there's a really interesting moment right now that the allopathic community has embraced psychedelics in this way, right? It's very sad that they certainly embraced them in 1957 to about the mid-60s, and then they became illegal. And for 50 years, they couldn't embrace them at all, right? I think that and then add to this the problem of kind of the pharmaceutical industry coming in and jumping in and making these substances, part of like the insurance paradigm, right? So I think there are several dangers and complexities and issues concerning the reinvention of the wheel, right? Is that you have in the medical community now an attempt to create guides who are going to guide you, right? Of course, in indigenous communities like in Oaxaca and the Mazatec, people have been doing this for years, right? Or for that matter, here in Northeast Ohio, you have a non-allopathic therapeutic scene where people are guides and have been guides for 30 years, 40 years. But the medical community is not looking towards them or looking towards some of the knowledge, shall we say the native knowledge or traditional knowledge, and they're trying to reinvent the wheel. The second thing, which I think is also complicated and confusing, is considering the side effect of the mystical experience, right? So what if somebody consumes this substance and thinks that they actually have a mystical experience and they see God, goddesses, or what have you, right? The Hopkins study, there's a Hopkins study where patients were given psilocybin and many claimed to have had a mystical experience, right? So what do you do with those sorts of experiences? And in the STEM scenario, you have doctors who are secular and may not be trained to respond to somebody who's had a mystical experience, right? So who should be there, right? Should there be a rabbi there if you've got a Jewish patient? Should there be some Hindu priest there or some, right, who can respond and help a patient understand, right? And the medical community is not embracing that yet. They're, of course, reinventing the wheel again, right? I think that it's kind of an interesting moment when this kind of these kinds of policies are going to be put in play. I'm getting into conversation with some people who are working on Ohio drug policy and psychedelics. So hopefully I'll be able to say something about it. But it's when I was on an idea stream with the psychiatrist at the Cleveland Clinic who's doing all these studies, he didn't know anything about the racial complexities concerning the creation of Schedule I drugs. So he didn't understand so much of the history of psychedelics that he seemed like kind of foolish to me. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a very complicated moment, right? But I can assure you that even if it becomes, and it is becoming accepted by the medical community, that non-allopathic use of this will continue forever.
Can you speak on more about the mind at large and about how, like, which is the unordinary consciousness or which is ordinary? Like, which is a mind without a filter? Is that unordinary, or is one with a filter unordinary because it's being limited?
So ordinary and non-ordinary becomes a peculiar thing when you think about this mind at large, or if you think of it kind of in Kantian terms like a real behind the real, right? So what is the real, what is ordinary, what is non-ordinary? And I think that the answer I would give you is that non-ordinary, ordinary becomes some peculiar human construction. And for the mind at large, which in the kind of, considering like the mind at large, is that consciousness in this way then is not differentiated, right? Is that when we differentiate from ordinary and non-ordinary, this is a kind of conventional human thing to do. That is, as I said, in the context of Foucault, is to create kind of power structures that oppress people, or to make people better workers. So I think finally, in the big picture, the distinction between ordinary and non-ordinary is something that is not, doesn't matter in the most abstract mind at large sense. Right? For sure, I'm giving you a Dhamma Buddhist answer to that.
The medicalization.
Yeah.
You know, we studied the likes of Punk and Griffiths, Johns Hopkins, and they've created this sort of mystical experience questionnaire, which implies there is a presence of a metric to measure such experience. Is there a way, because it appears that there's some sort of psychedelic resonance happening to where it's not going to, the allopathic community is not going to be halted. Is there the research for it? So is there a way, you mentioned that there's some more incorporation of like people like rabbis and stuff like that. How can scientific studies if at all, at what capacity measure it and still produce it with the likes of pharmaceutical companies, all that?
Right. It's
How?
a big mess, Alex, right? I don't, like, I think that it's, can you put a metric on something like love, right? Like, how much do you love somebody? Rate it from 1 to 10, and we'll make a graph, right? Right, so these are all very peculiar things that people try to do, right? And maybe it kind of boils down to whether or not you think that there can be an experience outside of language. If it's outside of language, then finally you won't be able to, you can try and metrify it as much as you want, but you'll never hit it, right? It'll always maybe be asymptotic or some delusion, right? So, but that's what's happening, right? That is what's happening. And insurance companies will want to know this metric, and and people will embrace it, and it's just another peculiar way of kind of the pharmaceutical industry and this kind of biopolitics, biopower to kind of squash the humanities. No, I don't know that. But what can be done?
I mean, I've been studying a lot about Oaxaca, that community, and that they're claiming that it's important to embrace not only the improved effects of what people have called depression, anxiety, stuff like that, but also to acknowledge, and similar to your story, that this appearance, this perception of the bus with the Dr. Seuss-like characters, other sort of perceptions that may be what we call non-ordinary. I guess as a future researcher, I question how are we able to, if at all, quantify that to show and progress and publish work that's authentic.
Right. I don't know either. It'll be up to you to figure that out.
Like alterations of consciousness vary widely, right? An anxiety attack could maybe be a bad alteration of consciousness, while a psychedelic experience could be a good one. Yeah. So my question to you is, while there may not be an ordinary state of consciousness, do you think there could be an ideal state of consciousness or alteration of consciousness?
Well, that's funny. Well, the ideal state of consciousness, as I've argued, is a state of being unconscious, which I have already achieved by accident. So, is there an ideal state of consciousness? Actually, to be more serious, right? And I didn't articulate this, but I'll do it now, right? Is it that the great worry for me that when we think about that there are ordinary states of consciousness, is that what that does is it reifies humanly created things, right? And so there's a danger when you think things are as they are, and you impose them on others, right? I mean, that's much of what people seem to do, right? So when you say, do I imagine an ideal state of consciousness? Maybe I would say that an ideal state of consciousness is questioning all consciousness, right? Such that the habit, or the kind of the violent habit of imposing your reified ideals on others will soon dissipate.
The metaphysical development of consciousness versus the STEM development of consciousness. As you know, when I was 1 year old, I was conscious enough to know that I needed to eat and sleep to survive. But at 4 years old, I was aware that my hands existed. And at 22, I know that I shouldn't bring my backpack to a high crime rate area. And science can look at your brain and say your frontal lobe is more developed now than it was at 16 months. But throughout that, is there a metaphysical stance of ordinary consciousness at different developmental states?
Well, let me see if I can answer that, right? So how do we account for for consciousness becoming more sophisticated, right? Or learning, shall we say, right? And then that's the first question you asked. And then you said that there's STEM versus metaphysical, right? So let me first say, and this was thanks in part conversation with Lee, thinking about consciousness last month, which was that consciousness being something that you can detect using these metrics, EEGs, and so on, right? And it was a great conversation, and I really appreciated it. And I said to but you can't pop it out like a grape, right? You can't go into someone's head and pop it out. But in a funny way, if you look at the EEGs and you look at these things, then you can carve it out and take it out in a funny sort of way, right? But even then, it's an invented kind of concept, right? That here's consciousness. not so different from saying soul, right? I mean, it's really God talk, as I say it. Right? It's really just God talk, or like religious stuff. Just like this, right? Except that you have some metric and you can see it, sort of, right? So that's one thought, right? And that's very different from a metaphysical, conceptual, very different, right? So how do we account for learning, right? I'll give you a Buddhist response, shall I? Okay. So as I said, in a kind of ironic way, the more you learn, the more conditioned you become, right? And then, of course, for the Buddhist, the more you're going to suffer, right? And so the goal is to become unconscious by that, right? So there's all this learning. What a funny thing to say in the university. This is bad thing. Unless you use it to recognize that these are all constructions and that it leads to suffering. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes.
Or it totally screws with it.
Can I ask like a quick follow-up to that?
Sure.
So even as infants, people are learning. I spent my first 16 months in an orphanage, and it's possible you become a narcissist. You have a label thrown on you, you develop narcissistic tendencies, you survive for yourself. No primary caregiver, but other children don't grow up in that same way, even through the same circumstance. Again, I guess, what is your metaphysical take on that, where conditions were similar but outcome was different, but there's such a base level of consciousness and understanding?
First, thank you for sharing. I'm not entirely sure. So you're saying that you're asking like a nurture nature thing?
Yeah. How does?
It's like I'm feeling nurture nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. And like what? Like, do I think it's nurture nature?
How is it possible if at 16 months there's probably not much difference in states of consciousnness, but
consciousness. What do you mean by consciousness?
Understanding of basic human needs.
Well, I was using it a little differently. But you sound more like you're going to kind of like a scientific reductionist thing. But I'm using it more in kind of just simple self-awareness, not self-awareness in the context of some German competitive posse in space. So I don't know if it answers your question. But thank you for sharing.
Just a couple of quick comments and maybe a question, maybe two questions. One, Stroke of Insight. I don't know if you know that book.
Nope.
She's a neuroscientist who basically had a similar experience. And really went on to do research about this idea of how in certain kinds of brain injuries, the left brain or more analytical side, or some of those analytical processes shut down, and sort of the right brain opens up, and that gives us a larger state of awareness, which I think is interesting. I'm curious what you might say about lucid dreaming and thoughts about lucid dreaming and how this fits into ideas of consciousness. And also if you would say a little bit about your research coming up and kind of questions that you gave us, I feel like an appetizer, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Sure. So lucid dreaming, right? So just give me a second, right? So I tend, I tend to think, as Kevin had asked, I tend to think in terms of the yoga charts where things are mind-blowing and stuff, right? So then lucid dreaming is just another cognitive event that occurs, and that we imagine that it's got a marker running against it, right? And these markers are humanly constructed, right? So you think that you're falling asleep, but you're not actually falling asleep. Or you think that you're walking around and seeing something different, but that's not actually happening. These moments are artificially created, right? So lucid dreaming, being awake, tripping on DMT, none of those things are really different, right? You're just having like a streaming consciousness, and you're imagining that you're having some distinct marker that changes, or that not changes. You have a distinct marker. It's like this is this moment, this experience, and this is this event. When in really it's just one streaming event. Right? Just like if you were to stream something on Netflix and there's a different segment, there are really no different segments, right? It's just streaming continuously. Yes?
So it's all It's all the waking dream, basically.
You could say something like that, or something like that. So yes. So what is my current work? That is a good question. So, so I have, of course, in the last few years, been thinking a lot, thinking about these issues of psychedelics. And now, currently, in the American Academy of Religion, I'm on the steering committee for psychedelics and religion, drugs and religion. And I think that that some of the work I'm doing right now is trying to set up kind of foundational sorts of materials for people who are thinking about these topics, because there's great questions, and I sort of suggested them now. So I'm talking with a couple of presses about doing some kind of volumes on the basic questions about psychedelics and religion. Right? So the questions about whether or not all the mystical experiences are the same, like it's called the common core hypothesis, things like that. It's one thing I'm doing. What else am I doing? I'm waiting to. I'm going to be doing likely I'll be doing an edited volume for Duke on Making Dead in Religion, which is another thing that I do. So there's a couple of things I do. Yeah. Have I said too much?
No, not at all. But I do want to give everybody a chance to continue to talk to you, but maybe more in a casual way.
Sure.
Because we have lots of refreshments. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to enjoy that and discuss all the amazing thoughts I know that have popped into everyone's head during your lecture, and have a chance to continue to talk to you. So.
But can I ask you, Lee?
Yeah.
So, it was really profound, the conversation that we had the other day. Right? It really shifted I was like, wow.
Well, just to everybody know, I am a psychologist,
Right.
and I have always approached consciousness very much from, I think, what we've defined as the STEM approach,
Right.
to consciousness.
Right.
So that was the context of our conversation. Yeah.
So I've said, obviously, not. I said some things critical of that. How would you reply? I'm curious.
About, is there an ordinary state of consciousness?
Sure. Yeah. What do you think?
Again, depending on how you define ordinary, right? Every one of us experiences consciousness in a unique way. Because I do agree that it's our brain in the sense that we are always filtering. And how we each filter is very unique to our own self in terms of our experiences, right? In terms of how our brain is wired. Much like you, I suffered a severe head injury.
You did?
Totally lost my memory for a period of time. Was very confused when I when my memory kicked back in. I don't know. I mean, was I conscious? Yeah, I was conscious, but do I have any memory of it? No. Therefore, did that consciousness exist during that period of time? I don't know. But it was a clear experience of how the way that your senses feed into your brain and are consolidated and are stored, right? It was that lack of storage that makes me wonder about the state of consciousness that I had, right? So it's clearly an altered state of consciousness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I had an experience again. I actually had a stroke.
Oh, God.
I had another complete absence of consciousness, but I was certainly communicating, right? So, I mean, I think as a psychologist, I'm kind of strange because reflecting back on it is so fascinating, right? Just having gone through it yourself and being able to think about it and reflect back on it, and then just see how it actually impacts the way that you think now. I'm sure you would say that you are not the same person that you were before you had your head injury. I'm not the same person that I was before I had my head injury, and I'm not the same person that I was before I had my stroke. So I don't know if I answered your question,
Well, thank you so
but
much for sharing.
I think that all of us are just constantly filtering information. We're surrounded by information, and as you said, when psychedelic drugs, they remove some of the filters, and so you're not focusing in on certain aspects of what's coming in. But there are other individuals who don't focus as well either.
Right.
And that can cause a struggle in the way that our world and reality have been constructed to be more for individuals that can focus, right?
Right.
And therefore, is that an artificial barrier that we have constructed as humans, but that they're actually able to benefit from,
Right.
what their senses are bringing in a different way, which is very much related to what you were talking about.
Really, the question that we really want to answer, we're not going to really have an answer. Has she done psychedelic? We won't answer.
No, we won't ask you that. Right?
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, and thank you all for